Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on this edition of One Plus One, it's our All Things England edition. And who better to talk about UK topics as well as any topics regarding international affairs than Pat Byrne, who's been a long time socialist Marxist activist. He's worked in the trade unions. He's been involved in lots of people power movements, particularly anti-imperialism. He is a frequent guest on the Barricade, and folks who and our Eastern European audience and folks who watch the Barricade know that we've had Boyan Stanislavski, the co-founder and editor-in-chief, many times here, as well as Maria Chanat, and of course Małgorzata Kubacevska-Figet. So, and yes, and we're going to be talking about the UK general elections. We may talk about how Britain has been faring since Boris Johnson got Brexit done, and all sorts of other topics. So, first off, Pat, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's been a long time coming.
Thanks, Youri. I should add that I'm of Irish heritage, so
yes,
my views of Britain, I wouldn't say 100% objective.
Okay.
And of course, I'm living in Brazil, in Brasilia,
Yes.
in the capital of Brazil. So I do come at it perhaps from a somewhat detached point of view, which I don't think is bad. But I'm following it day by day very closely. And
No problem.
I was a member of an activist in the British Labour Party for about 50 years, but until about it'd be nearly a year and a half ago now, when I was kicked out from my membership, along with most of the offices of the Labour International branch, which I was in, and
wow,
spurious grounds. But what can you do? There seems to be this drive now to get rid of most of the broad left and left people in the party, unfortunately.
And actually, and we've definitely covered on this program the witch hunt. We've had members of Labour Against the Witch Hunt, Chris Williamson, Jackie Walker, on the program to discuss the non-existent anti-Semitism crisis. Now, were you kicked out for non-existing anti-Semitism, ergo slandered, or were you kicked out because you said that we shouldn't be in NATO, we shouldn't be bombing Syria?
No, I was kicked out for something even more minor than that. It was for participating in an educational seminar organized by a group called Labour Left Alliance at a time when Labour Left Alliance was accepted within the party.
Yeah.
And then a couple of years later, it was prescribed by the party, and I've been kicked out for something done retrospectively when it wasn't illegal. But what can you do?
Unbelievable. And yeah, it's unbelievable. And actually,
I know, yeah. And all I was talking about was it's a subject I've done a lot of research on, was the history of the British Labour movement in the 19th century. So it's hardly the most controversial subject, but what can you do? And along with it wasn't just me. It wasn't just against me personally. Almost all the officers of Labour International were all one by one kicked out. So.
Yeah, it's just absolutely ridiculous. But that's a perfect actually one moment. That's actually a perfect segue to I thought I heard okay. Anyways, that's a perfect segue then to my first question, which is okay, so Britain is having a so your country of origin, Britain, is having its general election right now. Rishi Sunak, of the ruling Tory party, the Conservative Party, has called for this election, and in general, and I guess my first question I wanted to ask you is, why do you feel Sunak called this election? yeah, and actually, yeah, respond to that, and then we'll get into some of the more interesting bits, like which is criticizing or even applauding some of the elements of the Labour Party's manifesto, Lib Dems, and so forth. What do you think is going to happen, so forth? But yeah, I'm curious why you think Rishi Sunak caused this, and I actually should add this. So unfortunately, anybody who remembers Britain before this general election knows that Britain was bitterly divided because of the Brexit referendum. The broad Leave campaign, of course, won that referendum, and the country only dissolved into more chaos, more bitterness, more petty party politics internally and externally, against one another. Uh, Jeremy Corbyn, who was a student of Tony Benn, and definitely did represent the true, grassroots socialists, who many, of course, of working class background and so forth, do support the Labour Party. Unfortunately, Jeremy Corbyn was met with a lot of hostility, not only for his good socialist policies at home, but of course his anti-imperialism abroad, and of course his opponents within Labour and and outside of Labour, of course, smeared him and his supporters as being anti-Semites, no doubt because of Jeremy Corbyn's long association with Palestine solidarity. And of course, there's lots of other reasons why Jeremy Corbyn did not win the election against Boris, against Boris Johnson, and of course the previous prime minister before him, Theresa May. Just to give people, a little bit of a background. But that being said, anywho, Boris Johnson, he went for that low common denominator and exploited, the divisions, I believe, of the Labour Party regarding the whole European Union question. But long story short, Boris Johnson won and massacred basically, the Labour Party and the Corbyn project. Labour, of course, it's important to remember, even when on paper they were a socialist party or a democratic socialist party with clause 4, the Labour Party has often, how should I say, they campaign from the left, but they govern from the right, or actually they've always been very hostile towards their own working class base and so forth. It's always been very much a racist party, xenophobic party, imperialist party, pro-nuclear weapons party, Zionist party, and very, very much corporate friendly. But of course, it went way more to the right, first under Neil Kinnock, but very much under, the Blair Witch Project, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Corbyn was trying to push back against that. He certainly had popular people power support. That's how he even got, selected as, leader of the Labour Party. But anywho, the party's now basically like another center-right party under Keir Starmer, who used to be associated with, the Corbyn team. And, the Conservatives have had different leaders since Boris Johnson's term was cut prematurely for his silliness and stuff like that. But now it's under Rishi Sunak. And for me, I'm surprised that he called for this general election, because the Conservative Party, I believe this, the Conservative Party, when it was Boris Johnson versus Jeremy Corbyn, has proved that no matter what they do, no matter how awful they are to the majority working class, working poor, no matter what horrendous things they do in power, no matter how incompetent they even are sometimes, and even drunk too much on power, I felt that, that after Boris Johnson's victory, I said to myself, I give up on the British electorate. There's just no winning against the Tories, especially if much of the media, the Murdoch media and so forth, is supportive of the Conservative Party. So that being said, I was surprised that that the Tories dumped Boris and then dumped Liz Truss. But now they have Rishi Sunak, and I'm just surprised that he would call for this general election because he's insecure about reform, because some of the more far-right members of the Conservative Party say that he's too soft on immigrants, that he's too soft on whatever, that he's not bold enough in his, in his plans. So that's just my 2 cents about why the UK is even having this election. But I'm curious I'm curious your thoughts as to why you think Rishi Sunak called for this.
Well, before getting into that detail, just to respond to what your little intro there, I think that how the image of the British electorate is delivered to us by the right-wing media. So, so it's not as simple as that. So, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, his policies, when they did opinion polls, on most questions, his policies were very popular on public ownership of the rail, post, electricity, water, all those kind of things. His policies for investing in rebuilding the British manufacturing sector, and many other questions. And in fact, in the 2017 election, he came within, it was estimated, 40,000 votes nationally of winning the election. And I could, that's another whole story, how that could have been turned around. But when we get to the 2019 election, the biggest factor in that election was the continuing issue of Brexit, which had been carried by a referendum but had not been implemented, and had been an interminable all sorts of manoeuvres in the Parliament trying to get it implemented, it not getting a majority of the MPs who opposed it, etc. And so there was a huge frustration that had built up among many people who'd voted for Brexit.
Yeah.
And sadly, Labour under Corbyn had in 2017 had a position of saying, well, Brexit's been carried, it's going to have to be implemented, and that was therefore not controversial. But then by 2019, the right wing of the Labour Party persuaded Corbyn to change that position and go for a second referendum, which was felt as a betrayal by all the many millions of working class Brexit voters. And so, of course, they punished Labour at the election. Now, coming up to this question you asked about why,
and also important to note, when the Brexit referendum happened, what's often called traditional Labour voters, they are overwhelmingly in the North, in the Midlands, and in Wales, much to people's surprise, the former industrialized North, Midlands, and Wales voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. Some no doubt for right-wing reasons, but a lot of them, this is the grassroots of the Labour Party, were always against joining the European Union for left reasons, for left criticisms of the European Union's neoliberalism, overreaching too much into other countries' sovereignty. Tony Benn, who Jeremy Corbyn often calls his hero, was very much, a Lexit here if he was still alive. So I think it's also important to, note that. So
sure, of course, yeah. Well, unfortunately, we don't really have time to go into all these factors. But to respond to the question you asked, why did Rishi Sunak call this election? He had to call the election by next January anyway. So that was the limit he had. I think it was January 25th. So he decided to call the election early, partly because he wanted to show that he was in charge of the agenda. So he could decide, kind of a macho type thing that he was not going to be driven to the last moment to have the election. But beyond that, there's a lot of speculation and nobody really knows. But I think probably the most logical reason was that he'd managed to get, well, he didn't do it, but inflation had fallen down from about 9% to, or even higher, to roughly 2.5%, which is what he pledged to do when he took over as the Prime Minister. And therefore, he thought that would be a big selling point. He didn't have a lot of things going for him, and he thought this was a big selling point he would try and take advantage of. And he also he reduced taxation in the budget a couple of times, and he thought that would also help him. But none of these things made any difference because the population are just completely fed up with the Conservatives, who've been in power for 14 years. And under that time, people's living standards have fallen drastically, and all kind of, there's been massive austerity. All the public services have been cut to the bone. And perhaps the worst of all is the National Health Service, which was already in a terrible crisis. And then when COVID came along, it just made it worse. And since then, since the end of COVID, they've not been able to recover it. So at the moment, there are between 8 to 9 million operations outstanding in Britain, which in a population of 65 million is a huge amount. Yeah. And the result of it is not only that every family has members who are awaiting operations, it has also meant that something like 2 million people are currently on disablement benefit because they can't work because they're waiting for their operations. So you can see the disastrous situation. There's so many other factors to do with people's living standards and public services, but that kind of sums it up. So that we've got a situation now where, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
But that being said, now Rishi Sunak has said, now he's often blamed the pandemic, the coronavirus crisis, and Russia invading Ukraine for why there's been inflation, why why things have had to have cost more, and why people have not seen the wonders of the universe that is leaving the European Union because so quickly afterwards came the pandemic, which I think devastated a lot of people's economies. So before I give my opinion why I think he called this election, I'm wondering if you could respond to that, because I actually got into an argument with my parents about, well, doesn't Sunak have a point? I mean, England did have this awful pandemic, and now I don't blame what's going on in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. I certainly don't blame that for why inflation and cost of living has been going through the roof. But pandemic, years of austerity before that, in which I would say, let's start with Margaret Thatcher. I would say that would be one of the reasons why the NHS and people's cost of living is so spiraling out of control. So, but I'm curious. What do you think when Rishi Sunak and even his supporters say, "Well, we had the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine destroyed everything and anything"?
Well, first of all, let's recall that the two worst countries in terms of death rates from the pandemic were America and Britain, and that's no accident.
Yes,
because both countries.
Third place is the country you're based in, Brazil.
Right.
I'm sure that's sociopath Bolsonaro.
Yeah, Bolsonaro. Yeah, exactly. And the reason why in Britain it was so bad as it was in America, but particularly in Britain, was the long, as you said, from Mrs. Thatcher onwards, the long neoliberal period we've had of cutting back public services. And more specifically, the World Health Organization did try to get different countries around the world prepared for the possibility of a pandemic in the years before, running up to the pandemic, and Britain just didn't respond to them, and so they didn't have enough masks, they didn't have enough other kinds of equipment, and so on. And when the actual pandemic arrived, Boris Johnson, his priority was to actually protect business and protect profits. And so he didn't, they allowed, just an example, even up until like about June, I think it was, of the pandemic year, they didn't stop the flights from other countries. They just left it as a mess. And there are so many examples.
Well, I believe Boris Johnson, and he's not alone in this. I think most people who simply didn't even understand COVID were of the opinion, well, if a lot of people do get COVID, it's only, the very, weak and the elderly that are going to die, but young people, they'll have they'll have an
Sure.
immunity. That was called herd immunity, and I think Boris followed that.
Yeah.
But then, of
He
course,
did follow that at the beginning,
but
yeah.
of course, once shit really hit the fan, and we're living with a pandemic now, basically that's why like most countries around the globe decide to abandon that ridiculous idea and enforce lockdowns and social distancing and so forth.
Right. So that's the first problem. And it's funny, they during the pandemic, they had this thing every Thursday night where the Prime Minister would come out and people would come out of their houses and all clap for the NHS staff. But of course, and so they praised the NHS staff and the emergency workers and delivery workers and so on. But as soon as the thing stopped, then of course they went back to treating them like dirt as usual. So we've had a series of strikes, big strikes, long-running strikes in the NHS. So that has made things worse, undoubtedly, and so on. So for all those kind of reasons, and then of course we've had austerity since 2010, cutting back. When Labour left office, one good thing that Tony Blair had done was the profits that had come in during the big boom of the 90s and noughties. They had to use a certain percentage of them to build up the spending on the NHS. So when they left government in 2010, the popularity rating of the NHS was very, very high. People were very satisfied with it. But the Conservatives just constantly cut the NHS year by year, to the point where it was already in a crisis before the pandemic. And so the pandemic just was the final blow. And so that's the situation you're in. So that's about the NHS in particular. There's usually reasons for this. If you look into them, historical reasons for all of these things, why they went wrong. So for example, energy, what you talked about, the price of electricity, which shot through the roof and caused so much hardship for people, and raised the cost of living, made them cold in their apartments and reluctant to put on the heating and all that kind of thing. That all came about because of Mrs. Thatcher privatizing our energy sector. And as a result, we had a crazy situation where when the crisis came with Ukraine, Britain was not able to deal with it. If you look at France, which has a publicly owned energy sector largely based on nuclear, they hardly had to put up their energy prices at all. But Britain allowed them, and on top of that, of course, Britain didn't interfere when the energy companies made massive profits. They made billions and billions out of this crisis, and they didn't intervene and stop them. So there's all these factors in the background. So it's not like these are not acts of God. These are things that could have been avoided.
Unless,
yeah.
No, I completely agree with you on that, and I'm willing to say to Mr. Sunak and his supporters that yes, the pandemic did beat Britain up pretty badly, but you guys also can abandon your voodoo economics, your dogma that if we keep cutting taxes, if we keep privatizing everything and anything, if we keep cutting back on this and we keep cutting back on that and tightening the belts, including once it's over our neck, all is going to be hunky dory. But of course, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
But then, I'll tell you this. I think another reason why Rishi Sunak called this election, and again, this is something I don't understand about the Conservative Party, which is one of the oldest. I believe it is the oldest party in British history. I'm not sure what they were called beforehand, but it is one of the oldest parties and one of the most and one of the most successful right-wing parties, center-right parties, but very much a very successful right-wing party. And I remember when David Cameron, said that he was going to give the British public the right to vote in the referendum about Brexit. He did that because one or two, because like two or three Tories had defected to UKIP. Nigel Farage, of course, was becoming everyone's favorite, right-wing stand-up comedian and so forth like that. So he wanted to find, and of course, the Conservative Party, like the Labour Party, has always been very, divided when it comes to the issue of the European Union. But I'm of the opinion David Cameron didn't have to, call everybody's bluff on Brexit. I'm even surprised that he thought he would win it, given that, the people who support him, even his own parties, these are the kind of people who, Rupert Murdoch has, and many of the right-wing newspapers in Britain, whether it's the Daily Mail, the Spectator, the Daily Telegraph, have always been very supportive of, leaving the European Union and blaming, EU migrants or immigrants in general for all of the problems that, that Britain experiences. So I'm surprised that Cameron didn't think that he was going to lose the referendum just based on that social science alone. And I find Rishi Sunak is almost doing the same thing. So since he's become prime minister, there's been a new right-wing news outlet called GB News, and Nigel Farage has a program on GB News. Jacob Rees-Mogg has a program on GB News. In a nutshell, it's basically Sky Australia and Fox News, except with British accents, more or less. And they've been attacking Rishi Sunak. Many of the people who come on GB News's program, they often attack Rishi Sunak from the right, saying that he's too soft on the woke mob, that he's too soft on stopping illegal immigrants and even legal immigrants, and that's and of course, since this is the month of Pride, that he's also too soft when it comes to queer liberation and not putting a stop to transmania and stuff like that. and so I think Sunak is also responding to to that element of his Tory base, who also never really liked Sunak because they liked Boris Johnson and thought that it was wrong to have ended his prime ministership so prematurely. The grassroots Tory party really liked Liz Truss, but the old guard certainly thought that now is not the time to go crazy with tax cuts and stuff like that. Ergo, they ignored the will of their own people and then basically appointed Rishi Sunak. So I think Sunak is also responding to his party going more and more to the right, as if they weren't even right-wing enough. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't think he called the election for that reason, though. There was no, in fact, this election has turned out to be one of the most bizarre elections in the British history. And if not only just British history, but certainly of the advanced countries, all of them.
Yeah.
And this was the first example that there was a petition circulating among Conservative MPs from right and centre and left of the party, trying to get him removed or trying to stop the election being called by him. They were so shocked by this decision, which was only known to a relatively small handful of officials and so on, who we now found out then immediately tried to cash in and make money from this. This is the latest scandal, right? But they actually the MPs were realised that this was a disaster to go for the election. So they wanted to go in the autumn pretty well to the last gasp, hoping something would turn up, because they could feel that they were just going to get wiped out in the parliament. According to the opinion polls, Labour was like 20 points ahead, a ridiculous margin. So I don't think it actually, that internal battle that's going on within the Conservative Party and the broader right in Britain, I don't think that particularly influenced the date of the election. As I said, I think he just decided somehow or other that he thought he could pull it off. And of course, everything went wrong from the beginning. He came out, as you know, he came out to announce.
The conservatives
Yes,
never learned.
so
I feel like this is Theresa May all over again.
yeah, well,
round one against.
he came out. So he came out to announce the election, and then it started raining, and on top of that, for viewers outside of Britain who wouldn't really know what it meant, but there's a guy who happens to be in Whitehall, a protester who plays music. And he, for some chance reason, he put on this song, Things Can Only Get Better, which is a famous pop song, which was Tony Blair's election campaign song in 1997. And so as Rishi Sunak is announcing the election and the rain is falling, this song is going, Things Can Only Get Better. And
it was hilarious. I felt so, and like part of me kind of felt bad for him because here he is, like, and sounding like an idiotic robot. Like he just keeps like repeating like his like talking points over and over again.
Yeah.
And he's just getting soaked. Like you can visibly see this if you're watching. I was watching this on television, you know, with my mother. Right. And then you have like this, and then you clearly can hear a protester churning up the volume of some music. So while Rishi Sunak is like saying like whatever, like you gotta vote for. Anyways, it was so
then like, that was the beginning. So that was the beginning of the campaign. So that was the beginning of the campaign. Yeah. It just and they are supposed to be masters of public relations, right? But just every single day something went wrong. And the most basic thing. So for example, he went to a factory and there were a group of workers there with their overalls on. Yeah. And two of them were asking him questions, and it turned out that they were fake workers from Conservative Central Office dressed up in the workers' uniform. So that was then he went to Wales and he started talking in the pub with some people. And he was trying to talk to them about the European football games that were coming up, and he didn't realize that Wales had been knocked out of the tournament. And it just went on and on like this. And in fact, the theme of the campaign, the kind of slogan of the campaign has got the slogan is surely it can't get worse. and somehow or other it gets worse. And so the latest, of course, is this scandal about his staff all going to bet on getting to know the date of the election being so early, and then going to the betting offices and online and laying on bets all over the place. So this is and it's sorry, go ahead, man.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue then to this question, which is do you think Labour will have a comeback, and what's your opinion on the manifesto that Sir Keir Starmer rolled out?
Well, before getting on to Labour, let's just round up a little bit on this Conservative side, because one of the big problems the Conservatives have got is there's an alternative party to the right of them, Reform Party, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
Now, if he had not called this election early, Nigel Farage was due to head off to America to become officially part of Trump's election campaign. And he was going to play a role there at each meeting, and they were going to call him on the British angle and all that. Anyway, so then they called the election, and so the election was going on, and Farage suddenly realized, Jesus, there's a great opportunity here, and he had said he wasn't going to stand in the election, but then things were going so badly for Conservatives, he thought, oh, I can't miss this; it's too golden an opportunity. So he's the most popular politician in Britain, probably, being realistic. So of course his intervention to become the leader of the party and to stand for Parliament has made a huge difference already in the election. And now his party, which is a new party, so I think it's maybe 18 months or something old, is now running neck and neck with the Conservatives, or even ahead of the Conservatives.
Well, actually, basically, when Farage had started the Brexit Party with the bankroller behind him, Richard Tice,
Right.
After Boris Johnson had won the election, Jeremy Corbyn was vanquished. The Brexit Party later became the Reform Party, and they became a lobbying group against measures to try to contain the pandemic. So they were against lockdowns, they were against vaccine mandates and stuff like that. And and as I mentioned, Farage, who had a show on LBC, later, joined this new right-wing outlet, GB News, which I even think is more right-wing than even talk radio, which is Murdoch's baby, and certainly much more open in promoting social regressivism, or I'm sorry, social conservatism. Like being hostile towards trans rights and
Sure.
stuff like that. So that's Reform Party, and I actually do want to talk about some of their policies later too.
Sure.
And but I know when Richard Tice called a press conference and invited Reform Party members on the program, Nigel Farage, his opening remark in his speech, if anyone who's familiar with that stupid song from Eminem, Without Me, Nigel Farage goes, "Guess who's back? Back again."
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the Conservatives, I mean, another major cock up that the Conservatives got themselves into was when the Sunak went to the D-Day celebrations in
yes.
Normandy, and a couple of weeks ago, and and he stayed there for the morning's part of the ceremony, and then he left in the afternoon, while all the other world leaders stayed on. And he came back for a interview with ITN, I think it was, with the TV channel.
Yeah, yes.
And he now this is quite an interesting phenomenon because public relations has taken over from, it started in the 1980s in particular. Well, I mean, you can trace it back even to the 1920s in America, but it really exploded in politics in Britain from the 1980s onwards, and so to the point where now every politician has a PR team that they link up with, and so they use this to manipulate the public, and massage and try to deal with the crisis situations and so on. And it's very successful. It's been very, very successful in confusing the public and bamboozling them.
Yeah.
But the thing is that actually it's kind of got to a point where it's disappearing up its own backside. It's kind of that they're so used to using public relations, they're so reliant on it, that it's now kind of boomerang back on them. So, for example, he came back for public relations reasons. He came back to Britain, and he abandoned this important celebration of 80th celebration of the D-Day landings in the Second World War, and it was particularly significant because this was the last major celebration where probably any of the veterans would still be alive. Anyway, so he left the country. He left France, and he came back to Britain for this interview. And now the reason he was doing the interview was to defend his charge against Labour, which was a lie, that Labour was preparing to put taxes up on all households of £2,000 per household, which is a thing that was made up by him. So that was the first problem. So it was a PR lie. He was coming back to try to justify this PR lie. When it was put to him by the interviewer that, well, don't you think you've maybe made a mistake leaving this celebration? He then responded by, well, I don't think we should politicize this question of the D-Day landings and so on. The problem is that he precisely left the celebration for political reasons, to go and back up a lie that everybody knew was a lie. And it just went from one thing to another. And there was one female Conservative MP who broke down crying on the camera, and there was a cabinet minister who, when he heard about this, he just went, "Oh no!"
But you forgot the real, like, home run in hilarity, which is, I've noticed that, like, everybody keeps talking about, like, what their parents and grandparents, did during this election. That's their way to, like, try to show how common they are, that they understand people's, like, stress.
Right.
Sunak was asked about now Sunak, I'm going to now he's a very wealthy man. His wife is is very wealthy, but he comes from a very modest background. Now he's definitely, I don't think he was working class. I don't think he was super rich, but I do think he had a very comfortable middle class existence. With
that's right.
I believe his mother worked in the NHS, and his father had a pharmaceutical shop. Sunak was asked about, like, his struggles in his youth and stuff like that. In order to, I think, in response to how do you respond to people who say that the Conservative Party is out of touch and doesn't understand the struggles of working families, working class families? And Sunak said that, hey, my family struggled. And when the journalist asked him, well, what were they? First of all, he had a hard time coming up with something. But what he did come up with in the end was, we didn't have Sky TV. We did not have Sky TV. And for people who don't understand how ridiculous this sounds, Sky TV, which founded by Rupert Murdoch, or I think he was a minor, like, B Sky B and so forth, was this very popular satellite television. You could get all sorts of sports on it, and all sorts of American programs, movies, and stuff like that. And but again, for Rishi Sunak to say something like that, it
was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. Yeah,
literally, it's like what Marie Antoinette was alleged to have said when she was told about, like, the starving farmers who don't have, like, enough bread. Well, just let them eat cake. I mean, that's literally how ridiculous
I know
Sunak sounded. So I'm curious. So
this has provided us with a lot of hilarity, us in the, on the left, as you can imagine, right?
Yeah.
So the end result of this is that the Conservative Party have lost all credibility and are getting the lowest poll ratings that they've had in 100. Well, they didn't have polls in the old days, but the amount of level of support, the lowest they've had for hundreds of years. Now the other side of the coin is Labour, of course, the main alternative party. And you asked a question about, well, perhaps I could say, first of all, is that the strange phenomenon about this election is that people don't like either party.
Yeah.
They don't like Conservatives. They don't like Labour. They don't trust either party. So how I said about how public relations had disappeared up its own backside. What has happened is that all the politicians now are all trained in constant sessions with their public relations handlers to lie. It becomes totally second nature to them. So they lie even when they don't need to. They just constantly do it. And so Rishi Sunak lies all the time. Boris Johnson resigned in disgrace because he was lying all the time. Starmer, the Labour leader, lies all the time. And so, of course, the population has got fed up to the back teeth with all this lying. So so when you see the popularity ratings of the leaders, you'll find that, I think the figure I'd seen, and it's probably changed, it's probably got worse. I think it was -70 for Sunak and -55 for Starmer. Incredible.
I find that quite interesting. But that being said, and also, since Keir Starmer,
these are minus figures.
but also
These
now
are
I
not
know
plus figures.
now I know why a lot of our friends who are true leftists, I know why a lot of them don't like Keir Starmer. Since Keir Starmer has become leader of the Labour Party, he has kicked out more or less anybody that has a left-wing bone in them. Anyone who was a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, he's kicked out of the party.
Yeah.
He's kicked out the man himself, Jeremy Corbyn, who has to run as an independent. But listening to the manifestos of the different parties, so Labour, yeah. So I'm curious what you think about Labour's manifesto, because now I understand why people don't trust Keir Starmer, and I mean I've never been a fan of the Labour Party. So if I was in Britain or in Scotland or in Wales or in Northern Ireland, I would never ever vote for the Labour Party. But that being said, it's not. I don't feel his manifesto is as right wing as people make it out to be, because he is pledging that he's going to spend a lot of money on the NHS. He's a bit vague when it comes to mental health, but he wants to also like expand dental care. He is going to raise taxes on some of the affluent, the 1%ers, or the one. So he has pledged to do some of that. He has been very blunt with people when he says that he can't promise this and he can't promise that, given the mess that the Conservatives have left us. So I'm curious if you have heard or studied Labour's manifesto. What do you think of the manifesto under Mr. Starmer?
Well, I have to say that my view of the manifesto is a different manifesto than the one you just described.
Okay.
And in fact, the strangest thing is that all the mainstream commentators, from the BBC to ITV's, Sky, Channel 4, the main question they asked the Labour candidates and the Labour leader is that, what your manifesto is just so offering so little different from the Conservative manifesto. In fact, there was an analysis done that this is the most right-wing, least commitment manifesto in the history of the Labour Party, and it's much less than even the Conservatives are promising, and that never mind the Liberal Democrats and so on, and that Labour has made a fetish out of not promising things. So their argument is, oh well, if we don't promise things, then we can't be accused of breaking them, So, and when it comes to tax, for example, they have studiously avoided putting forward any serious taxation on the rich. So the only taxes they're talking about are two minor marginal taxes that will hardly affect anybody, a small number of people, and will raise very little money. And they've what their big campaign has been, because they're being under attack by the Conservatives for secretly preparing tax rises, and their argument is, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to put up income tax. We're not going to put up. We're not going to introduce a wealth tax. We're not going to put up VAT, etc., etc. And we're not going to spend lots of money because there isn't that money available in the country. And so, for example, on an NHS, people ask the question, you say you're going to do these things with NHS, but where's the money going to come from? They're not saying. And they haven't got the money to do it. I mean, the money's available.
And he has made vague promises that those of the middle class, and certainly those of a working class background, will actually get tax relief, which is what the Conservatives also claim, that they're going to lower taxes for everybody, including. Yeah. I mean,
the thing is that so basically we're in a very weird situation where, unlike Tony Blair when he came to power in 1997, there's a good parallel here. Blair had the big advantage, and he came in on a landslide victory for Labour, but he had the big advantage of coming in the middle of a world boom, that big world neoliberal boom. Yeah. So that meant that the government gained. It itself started off very conservative in its tax and spend policies, but it was getting increased income just from the growth of the economy, which increases the tax yield and so on. we're now in the complete opposite situation where Starmer will come to power in the midst of a terrible economic crisis, where unless you're willing to raise taxation in a serious way on the wealthy, you won't have money to do these things that it's talking about, solving the NHS crisis and all these other problems. You know, the water crisis, where they're pumping huge amounts of sewage into the lakes and rivers of Britain, and all kinds of other problems that we've got. And he's not only that, but for example, he's refused to, which at least the Scottish Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats have said they will do. He's refused to lift this two-child cap on benefits, which is causing massive amounts of child poverty in Britain, and children are going to bed hungry and things like that.
So in
and
other
he's
words,
refusing to do that.
So actually, let's briefly talk about that before we get back to the manifesto.
Right.
This cap on 2 children. So any family, but of course this so any family that has more than 2 children doesn't get certain benefits if they're struggling economically and whatnot.
That's right. Yeah. So in the past, you used to have you had a thing called child benefit, which a mother would get so much money for each child. And then the conservative newspapers, particularly and the conservative right-wing politicians, they made a big song and dance about all these people, these feckless working class families with large numbers of children, which was ridiculous, because actually Britain's birth rate, you know, it is very low now. So that was a stupid, but it was good propaganda. So they introduced a law that only 2 children could receive the child benefit, and any more children, if you had 3, 4, 5, then you would end up with a situation that you know, in poverty for the children. You didn't have the money to buy their food. So that's where we are at the moment. And Labour is refusing point blank. And he's even gained him the nickname of you know, Keir Starmer being Keir Starmer child starver. They called him, you know. And
like Snatcher, the milk snatcher.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So you know, you're talking about, and he's setting his face against any progressive measures. And his main interest is to reassure the ruling elite of Britain that he's their man. And that's why we've now got a crazy situation where the latest figures have just been released on donations to Labour and the other parties. And the Conservatives, that Labour has got £5 million being donated to it, almost entirely by the businessmen, big businessmen, who some of them were strong fats rights who've now come over to Labour in the last few weeks. And I think the Conservative Party have only got £300,000 being donated to them. So the ruling class of Britain have basically decided to switch allegiance to Labour, and they want them to win. And that's why they're backing them.
For me, it's going to be I'm going to be very interested to see which newspapers and magazines endorse which parties, because that's always also very
wow,
very telling. But that being okay, so you're not impressed with Keir Starmer's manifesto, and thanks for explaining why leftists should not be impressed with Labour's manifesto. But then I gotta ask you, what do you think of the Liberal Democrats' manifesto? Because I was quite impressed with their manifesto, in which they talked a lot about helping the NHS. They talked a lot about, like, social care and hiring social care. How are they going to get the money? Well, they say by taxing, of course, the banks, big banks and other big businesses who have made a killing, who have been making profits, energy companies themselves. Now, the Liberal Democrats, many people are still punishing the Liberal Democrats for getting into a coalition government with the Conservatives under David Cameron and unleashing the hounds of austerity. All that being said, and it is true also that the Liberal Democrats have also pivoted to the right on a lot of issues, and I've also welcomed ex Tories into their party simply because they were Remainers. And look, I'm not a fan of the Liberal Democrats. I certainly don't like their foreign policy. But that being said, listening to their manifesto, it sounds pretty good, and I actually think it sounds much better than the Labour manifesto. And so I'm curious. Your thoughts. So I'm curious your thoughts on the Liberal Democrats before I have a follow up. Yeah. So I'm curious.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's worth our actual wasting time on this, because the Liberal Democrats, they may get 50, 60 or 70 MPs. They will have no influence on the next government. They can say what they like. As you say, they broke all their promises before anyway, so they don't have a lot of credibility. And they're really kind of like a home for Conservative voters who don't want to go all the way over to Labour. And that's why they're going to win. Any seats they do win are going to be mainly Conservative seats in the South. So I don't think that they're going to make a lot of difference. I mean, Labour's going to come into power with a massive majority by pretty well everything we can tell. To me,
that being said, that's interesting that you say that. But that being said, let's say Labour wins but doesn't have a majority, just like when David Cameron won against New Labour.
But why are we discussing this? Is not going to happen.
But well,
this is the most safest. This is the most certain election in the history of British elections. So all we're arguing about here, when you go and talk to people in the streets, everybody wants to vote against the Conservatives. It's not worth discussing that. The argument is how big is Labour's majority going to be? Not is there a possibility of having parliament?
But then if Labour hypothetically, if Labour wasn't to get their majority, that they needed somebody to help prop them up. Hey, David Cameron did it with the Lib Dems. Theresa May did it with those knuckle-dragging Neanderthals, the DUP from Northern Ireland. So hypothetically, if you had like a Labour Lib Dem coalition or supply-demand government, I think that would be a good case scenario, because I think it would make the left wing of the Labour Party, those grassroots people who want the Labour Party to be a Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn party, and the Lib Dems, who do have their own socially liberal left-wing faction too, to lobby both of them to make sure that they actually do good stuff, and a little bit of a timeout from austerity, but not ending austerity entirely, because that is the raison d'etre of capitalist politicians in Britain. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't have any thoughts on it. Because what's the point of talking about a ridiculously hypothetical position when there are much more important perspectives of what to talk about, what's going to happen under Labour, both to the right and the left? Waste our time talking about the Liberals.
Before we get into the predictions game of what could happen with a hypothetical, what's this possible incoming Labour government? Right. Then I have to ask, this question, which is what do you think of? What do you think of? Now, we don't have many independents running, but it is an unprecedented number of independents running against the two-party, and if you believe in Liberal Democrats, this whole three-party system. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. So you have Andrew Feinstein, lifelong South African Anglo, anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, and he is of a Jewish background, who's trying to unseat Keir Starmer in his constituency, which a friend of mine actually lives in. And you have others. There's this wonderful Anglo-Palestinian woman, Leanne Mohammed, who I really hope she wins. I like a lot of her policies. And then, of course, and then you have other examples of people who are left-leaning running as independents. And then, of course, there are other left-wing parties. There's George Galloway's Workers' Party of
Workers'
Britain,
Party.
and of course, and of course, the Green Party. So I'm curious, what do you think about that? Because I've also have heard from people, including folks that both you and I know. I saw Jackie Walker and her crew on Redline TV talking about how they were basically going to tactically vote. And Jackie says that she's going to vote for that she's going to vote for the Greens. Others said that they're considering voting for an independent or a Green, or maybe a Lib Dem in the event that they have a good chance of beating the Conservatives. And Graham Bash, Jackie's partner, he is going to, I believe he's going to vote Labour, but he did say, in a hypothetical situation, if I wasn't living where I'm living, if I was living in Chris Williamson's constituency, I'd vote for her. If I was living in this constituency, I would vote for the Greens. If I was living in this constituency, I would vote for George Galloway. And so do you think many left-wing voters or left-leaning voters are actually going to behave like that, come July 4th?
Well, it could have happened. That possibility was there. And there was a window towards the end of last year, coming to the beginning of this year. There was a window in which the left could have united, and particularly if Jeremy Corbyn had come off the fence at that point, instead of leaving everything until the last moment now, which is actually causing him problems in his election campaign, because he's left it too late to actually canvass everybody in the constituency and explain that he's not actually the Labour candidate, why, and also to build up a proper machine. But if he had offered the lead, then there was a possibility in the early part of this year where we could have got a united left alternative to Labour, and if they had have adopted a good name for their campaign and a really attractive manifesto, they could have offered a credible alternative, particularly with the Gaza question. That was very hot at that point. Anyway, unfortunately, and George Galloway demonstrated in Rochdale the potential there of an alternative to Labour in a very strong Labour area. But sadly, he didn't do that. So the end result has been that the left is,
I believe the party and the organization you were talking about, we actually talked about this off the air once. I believe that party was the Breakthrough Party, which later became Transform. And
no.
Oh, okay.
It needed to be something much bigger than any of the small groups that existed, like the Breakthrough Party or the Transform or Tusk or the Workers' Party, etc. And when I talked to quite a few of these leading figures in these parties, they said to me that if Jeremy Corbyn was willing to take the plunge, they would come behind him in a joint organisation. The trouble was that didn't happen. So we've ended up with the classic Monty Python-esque, are you the party of Judea or the Judean People's Party? It's that sort of situation where we've got areas of the country where there are 5 or 6 independent left candidates in the one constituency. Madness. So, of course, there has been some coalescence into a thing called the collective, but it's all been pretty late. It's not actually got a very coherent program, etc. Doesn't really have a membership. So the result is that the chance that there was has pretty well passed us by. Having said that, there are a few areas of the country where the individual independent candidate, radical independent candidate, may have the credibility to mount a serious challenge. Well, obviously, you've got Jeremy Corbyn in his own constituency. You've got Faiza Shaheen in East London. You've got there's a candidate up in Blackburn, if I remember rightly. And a few spotted around who've got a good name, got a good record image in their constituency, and where there's often is a large Muslim community who are willing to come behind them. And so it might be that you'll see a few independents win. 2 or 3, 4, whatever. But even Jeremy is under threat. So we don't know what's going to actually happen. But the great opportunity that there was this time around has passed us by. There's the Green Party, which, and I think the Greens unfortunately have damaged their copybook in Europe by the totally reactionary role they've played in Germany and in some other places has damaged the brand of the Greens, and a lot of people don't trust them. They think that and even in the election campaign here, the Greens are running they're running 2 different campaigns. They're running a leftish campaign in the Labour areas, and they're running a kind of right-wing campaign, don't build in our backyard, in the Conservative areas. Trying to appeal to middle-class people, saying, no, we don't want housing here, we don't want windmills here, blah, blah, blah. So they're highly opportunist, which is how they operate. Which is how they operate everywhere anyway, generally, isn't it? They're very opportunist.
If you are a member of the Green Party of Britain, of England and Wales, you have every right to, of course, respond to what Pat said. But actually, it's interesting that that you mentioned that, because yes, the Green Party in Germany and also the Green Party in Canada is completely reactionary. These are not eco-socialists like the great Dr. Jill Stein, John Mubarak, Ralph Nader, and so forth in the U.S., which I find is actually quite interesting when you think about that. The Green Party of England. I know many young people, including friends of mine, who probably would have voted for the Greens in the past, are considering voting for the Greens now. But my problem with the Greens is look, I love their Green New Deal. I think they're perfect on NHS and so many socioeconomic issues. I'm nothing against them, and so in that respect, I wish them the best of success as they try to be both, Labour, Tories, and the Liberal Democrats. My issue, though, with the Green Party, and why I don't share the kind of left enthusiasm other people might share, is because Caroline Lucas, when she she still is okay. Well, during the height of the smear campaign and the witch hunt against the left and anti-Zionists of the Labour Party, Caroline Lucas played a really dirty game in sort of jumping on the bully bandwagon of that, and she is on record being more or less very supportive of NATO and supporting non-existent moderate rebels in Syria, and on top of that, and on top of that, as much it's an honorable position to be an EU left reformist, which the Greens are, the SNP, Yanis Varoufakis, and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, look, the public voted to leave the European Union. You can talk till you're blue in the face why you think the European Union is a great thing, what should be reformed about it, but just like guns in the United States, you're not going to convince an electorate that the European Union is this wonderful thing which Britain should be a member of. And the fact that the fact that it was the Greens that pushed for this ridiculous second referendum, which was electoral suicide for everybody, anyone that stood by that. That's sort of why I have that's at least my problem with the Greens. But I don't fault anybody that wants to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of progressive people have joined the Greens, including a lot of ex-Labour Corbyn supporters that have joined the Greens, and I wouldn't want to knock them, and they're doing the best they can. And the leadership of the Greens are putting generally a more left position. By the way, one of the ironies of all this is now they are all being accused of being anti-Semitic. So there you go. It bites you in the end, doesn't it? Exactly. But the trouble is, of course, the British system of first past the post means that even if you got millions of votes, which the Greens might get, their chances of getting more than 2 members of Parliament are very slim. And so that's one of the, so whatever you do, whether you have independents from the left or the Greens and even the Reform Party from the right are suffering from this. They're none of them are likely to get many MPs. But where Nigel Farage has a more longer term and more successful strategy is he's not just worried about getting MPs in Parliament. He's more interested in changing the nature of the debate and moving the whole narrative to the right. And he's been very, very successful about doing that in the past. And he's hoping that what will happen is that Labour will get to power, which is a very right-wing version of Labour, as you said, right of centre, not even left of centre anymore. And so you'll have the whole debate will be between a right-wing form of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, which is moving further and further to the right, and a reform movement out in the country, all linked up with the right-wing newspapers, GB News, and so on. And as a result, you're going to see the whole nature of the debate will be influenced to the right. Now, the only thing that could counteract that is that one of the ironies in this election, which is not being talked about in the media, because perhaps people are not aware of this, is that the size of the Labour landslide could actually strengthen the left Labour forces in Parliament. The reason being is that last year, when the right-wing Labour candidates were stitching up all the safest seats that they wanted to go for, there were all these Conservative seats, Conservative marginals and Conservative even safe seats that they didn't want to stand in because they knew they couldn't get elected. And then suddenly we're finding that all but the most safest Conservative seats look like they might go to Labour. And so as a result, quite a number of, they may not declare themselves, but they're essentially Corbynistas, are parliamentary candidates around the country and could very well get elected to Parliament. So we could see the Socialist Campaign Group get bigger, maybe even double in size. It's possible in such a large parliamentary Labour Party. And on top of that, I think by having such a domination of the Parliament in terms of MPs, there won't be any, there won't be that pressure to vote behind the government to keep it in power. And so there'll be a lot more freedom. People will feel a lot more freedom to express themselves. Now, of course, the regime inside Labour is very Stalinistic, so they will threaten people to kick them out of the Labour Party. But then maybe a lot of those MPs will think, well, we won't win the next election anyway. This is a freak situation we've got elected in on. So we'll do what we want, and we'll do what in our conscience. Now, even the middle of the road Labour MPs, I think that they're going to find it very difficult to go along with what Starmer's going to do. If Starmer's going to, I think the Labour government is going to be an austerity government. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has done these analysis of the finances of Britain in a conventional sense, because they're quite a neoliberal institution. But they've looked at the finances they've looked at them in a very conventional sense. So they're not expecting any of the parties to put up the taxes significant on the rich. So if they stick within that parameters, they just won't have the money to spend, and they'll in fact have to make major cuts in public services and all the rest of it. And on top of that, it does look like a recession is developing in America, and therefore we're talking about an even worse economic outlook in Britain. So as a result of all that, it's quite possible that we could see Labour get into a situation where a split develops in the Parliament, where the Labour, like in 1929 Parliament, where the recession, the Great Depression came, and the leading members of the cabinet decided to break from Labour because they wanted to make these major cuts, and they formed a national government with the Conservatives and the Liberals. I could even see that they've become so divorced from the ordinary working people and from the Labour movement and from the trade unions, these characters, much to a much greater degree than ever in the history of the Labour Party, I could see that a crisis could come along in which a split occurs. So that's one scenario we could see. And so we could actually see if the left does its act properly in the countryside, so that they don't just have a passive attitude, but they mount major struggles and strikes and demonstrations and so on. And the left in Parliament also represents those views. Then we might see that debate not just being between the Labour right and the right, but it could also be with the left. And that's the only silver lining that I can see in this situation. Just to finish on that.
Go ahead.
So Labour then there could be two ways that could go on the left. It could be that there'll be a split in the party and the left could start to come back in Labour. It's possible. We should never rule that out. It seems very hard to imagine it now, or there could be a split in the Labour Party where some of the big unions leave the party, along with a large number of members of the Parliament, and they form a mass party on the left of British politics. That's another possibility. But of course, the trouble is that the electoral system makes it very, very difficult for that to work. So we don't know. So these are all possibilities that could happen if we do have this kind of crisis, which could well come.
Well, I have three last questions. So this question is about Reform UK. So Nigel Farage has said that it's funny because Canada, Canada actually comes into this conversation. So Nigel Farage has said that he wants to destroy the Conservative Party and he wants to be the real opposition to what he thinks, like yourself, is going to be an incoming Labour government, and he wants to be the real conservative right-wing opposition. And he says that if his party wins, that if the Conservatives are vanquished enough, that his party actually becomes the major opposition. He basically has used this model with what happened in Canada when the Reform Party was this right-wing alternative to the progressive Conservatives, who were very right-wing. They were very right-wing. Brian Mulroney, that was Canada's version of Ronald and Maggie and Bob Hawke. But indeed, at the end of Brian Mulroney's reign of terror, the Reform Party became more or less the leader of the opposition against the Liberal government. The PC, were vanquished. They only retained 2 seats. But later, the Progressive Conservatives, when trying to mount a comeback, they later merged with the Canadian Alliance. So Reform later became the Canadian Alliance, and the Canadian Alliance and the PC merged. That's how we have the Conservative Party. Stephen Harper, who was part of Reform Party, and the students of Preston Manning, he was the first, conservative, prime minister of that party. So Nigel would like to see something like that happen in Britain, but I'm not really interested in whether Nigel Farage will become, the new, become leader of the opposition. I think it's a long shot. I think it's a long shot because UKIP has tried. UKIP tried to do that with the Tories, and didn't go far unless it was in European elections. Ironically, I'm more interested in this about Nigel Farage. So. He has said the following in his contract. He insists we don't call it a manifesto. So in his contract, he has put out the following. He wants no immigration, basically, in a nutshell. He wants to stop subsidizing green energy, green technology, and all of that, and just go back to the fossil fuels, let them frack and whatnot. He wants nobody to pay taxes unless they're making £20,000, which I think is quite interesting. And in terms of the NHS, apart from, I know some people have said that he basically wants to allow more privatization of the NHS, but when he was explaining what's in his contract, and every time he's been on the debate stage, he keeps saying that he thinks Britain should adopt the
The
French model of
French is,
healthcare,
yeah.
which I find quite interesting. So what's your response to Farage is basically nobody pays any taxes until they make £20,000, and and what do you think of him propping up the French model? And it's important to say this about the French model: it's very socialistic, it's very much a public friendly thing. They have a form of pharmacare in which your pharmaceuticals are heavily subsidized. Everybody is covered except for tourists who are only in France for like what, 2 weeks or 2 months. And yeah, I just find it's interesting that Farage would prop this up, and I find it's very interesting that everybody keeps attacking him for his xenophobia. And when it comes to the NHS, I'm surprised that even the Greens and the SNP implied haven't all gone, that is what we need in Britain. We need a French model. In other words, I don't know, just a much more robust, proper NHS and not a privatized NHS. So I'm curious what you think about Farage's tax policies and him talking about the French model.
Well, about the NHS, it's all about how much money you're willing to spend as a percentage of your wealth, And the problem is that Britain is now spending far less than the average countries in Europe, like Germany and Denmark and Scandinavia and Netherlands and France. And so that's the bottom line of it. Whatever system you have, I mean, they did show under Blair and Brown, they did show that if you spend the money, you get a good result. And so there's many other things also about the NHS which we could talk about in terms of democratizing the NHS, because the NHS is still a very top-down body. But and I think that would make a difference. But anyway, on the taxation, I mean, these are all.
The fact of the matter, but going back to Farage propping up the French model, do you find?
Well, I'm not taking any of these things really. I'm not really taking any of these things very seriously, because these are new policies that he's putting out, right, for the first time. And he admitted when he was challenged about his policies, he said, well, these are not policies for a government. We're not going to form a government. So these are just ideas, he said, and that's, so I'm not, but I think the reality is that he's basically very much a neoliberal who's trying to represent the small businessman. That's his, and he made a big thing out of and when he took over as leader of the reform about a month ago, he made a big thing out of talking about. He constantly talked about the self-employed, the self-employed, the self-employed. Mm-hmm. So he's trying to be the voice of the self-employed, and he even attacked the big corporations, who he said the Conservative Party is basically a few leaders backed up by these big corporations and a corrupt relationship. Well, it's true. So I think his ultimately his policies in practice would be very reactionary. So I don't take him too seriously, and I don't think he takes himself too seriously. He's more interested in just putting things that would sound popular, but from the right-wing point of view. Where the left has gone wrong, sadly.
But that being said, before you talk about his his tax policies and whether it's more voodoo junk economics, but has there been a government in France that has done free market reforms in their healthcare, and that's why Nigel is propping up the French model? Or
like I say, I don't think we should take any of his individual policies seriously, and he doesn't really himself. What I find interesting, what he's trying to do is he's trying to put forward propaganda. These are not really policies. He's trying to put forward to make what seems to be attractive policies, populist policies for the right. Now, I think we should be doing the same for the left. The tragedy was that the Workers' Party under George Galloway, I thought that he was going to try to do that. But funnily enough, he's decided not to do that in this election. And he's gone for a policy platform which is designed to appeal to the left and the right, and not to emphasize the class issues mostly. So, for example, he's made so much noise about the woke issues, as he calls them, about the sexual questions, abortion, whatever they might be, trans and whatever, which are not the things. I don't understand why he's done that, because if he was trying to win over the right wing, well, they're not going to support him because of his international policies and other left-wing policies.
Exactly.
If he was trying to win the left wing over, that's going to put them off, the way he's expressing himself unnecessarily divisively. What he hasn't done, which is what I thought he would do, is he would try to occupy this massive space, this vacuum that's been left by the Labour Party on the left. So Labour's now got the most right-wing social democratic policy, can't even call it social democratic anymore, in its history. And there's all these workers now who want something more radical in terms of living standards, trade union rights. Or there's hundreds of thousands of ex-Labour Party members who are supporting Corbyn, and they're looking for something to rally behind, but he didn't offer that, sadly.
No,
so
it's actually it's interesting that you mentioned George Galloway, because I was actually going to talk about Galloway's heteronormative views, because I'm hoping to do some episodes about queer liberation in the future. But I have been very quite disappointed, and I thought even if George Galloway is socially regressive, socially conservative, I would have thought that him knowing, I just would have thought that he would have stuck to his lane, which is anti-imperialism.
Right.
So, some workers' rights, which he can easily work with other people on, sure, and so forth. Yeah, him, complaining about wokeism, complaining about teachers talking about 72 genders and stuff like that. I've been very disappointed, because that's the kind of nonsense I would expect from a right-wing Tory, from Reform, not from somebody of the left. And even if somebody of the left does harbor transphobic views, heteronormative views, I would have thought they would be smart enough to be like, okay, I'm not really going to answer those questions. I'm just going to campaign on anti-imperialism, workers' rights, ending austerity. So it's been quite disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, he's actually
and his party has decided to go in that direction.
He's put his own personal prejudices, like about abortion and some of these other issues, which is coming from his religion. He's entitled to those views if he wants to have them, but he's put them to the fore. And what he's actually done also is, I think he's demonstrating that the Workers' Party is not democratic, because I'm sure that they're not the views of the vast majority of Workers' Party members. So, who are a lot of them are working class left-wing people who wouldn't necessarily agree with him about some of the religious questions and abortion and so on. So why I think he tactically thought he was being clever, that there's this constituency, and you see it on his YouTube channel, on his Moats YouTube channel. Yeah. The way he's posing questions to try to appeal to the Trump people, to try to appeal to the left people, and I think he falls between the two stools by doing that. So that's one thing. I think even Jeremy Corbyn, for example, I find that I don't find his policies are enough pro-worker. I find they tend to be too liberalistic and moralistic, a bit like a vicar preaching, we've got to stop the homeless, and this kind of approach, which I agree with, of course, but I felt that Bernie Sanders at his height, when he was actually, before we saw his degeneration, he was talking about the billionaire class. He was making it very much a workers' movement, much better and much more effective as a result.
Yes,
I think that's where Jeremy Corbyn, all through the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, He's never been as good as Bernie Sanders on these class questions, in my opinion.
See, I completely agree with you. I actually completely agree with you on that. And I think Bernie was also good in that he would sometimes go out of his comfort zone, and he would go to Liberty University, which is Jerry Falwell, who's this Christian fascist of the 1980s. It's his son. It's his university that he's founded. Very, very socially conservative and so forth. And Bernie went there and said, and basically in a nutshell, his speech was this: I don't agree with you guys on abortion. I don't agree with you guys on gay marriage. Let me tell you what I think we both do agree on. We're living in a system where only 1% controls all of the wealth. Talks about like the billionaire class. He throws in a little bit of like Jesus and the Beatitudes and so forth. And he has a whole place overpopulated with right wingers standing up and giving him like in applause. And it's and yes, and in general, Jeremy Corbyn, nice guy, but I think a lot of times sometimes his greatest strengths were his weaknesses, sometimes his greatest weaknesses were his greatest strength. And the people around him just did not know how to formulate Jeremy Corbyn so that he could be a great campaigner and converts people into the cause, not already people who are the whole preaching to the converted. But yeah, long story short, I have been very disappointed at by George Galloway's socially conservative skills, because a lot of people on the left, especially if they are of a background, of a queer background or of an immigrant background, I've been quite shocked at how he says that, how he talks about controlling our borders. Rishi Sunak is a mess in controlling our borders, when he's always been very. Anywho, it's long story short, very disappointing, and I completely agree with what you had to say about that. But if there is, I'll let any left voter. It's their choice if they do want to vote for that party, or a Green, or or an independent. If they have one, I'll let a left voter choose that. But it's very. But that being said, going back to two last things. So going back to Farage's sort of tax policies, because I'm very curious. Okay, so only when you make £20,000, Nigel thinks that you should pay taxes. But on the other issues, he is, as you say, it's very, very, very right-wing stuff. So having no immigration whatsoever, and he's even talking about legal immigration. I believe he said that to get people off benefits, he'll have them go to a website. They'll get 2 or 3 choices. If they don't accept any of those choices, boof, they lose their benefits. On education, he's not very clear about what he would do with education. I think he wants to keep it the way it currently is. He is a supporter of grammar schools, but he wants a patriotic syllabus, because apparently too much woke teachers are teaching about how awful the British Empire is, which I find funny, because I know people who have went through the British education system, and they say to me, we didn't learn anything about the British Empire and how awful it was. But his whole, his whole tax policies, What's your thought on that? But before I ask a very quick follow-up question to that.
Well, I mean, it's I mean, the thing is that these individual policies don't address the crisis of Britain, so they're kind of not going to make any fundamental difference. They're just playing around with the, just try and get votes of a certain group of people and stuff like
But
that.
how many people? But how many people in Britain? Now, how many people in Britain don't make £20,000? I would imagine, given that there is so much poor people, and I'm not talking about people who are chronically unemployed and are struggling to live, and some become homeless. I'm talking about the working poor and the precarious middle class, people who jump from internship to internship, or people who have who work 2 or 3, 4 low-paid jobs. It could be a factory job. It could be it can be working at H&M or something like that, or working in like the fast food industry. Now I know for a fact they're probably not making £20,000, so that wouldn't make a difference. But if a majority of people are poor, though, are working poor in Britain, and they're not making £20,000, well, okay, so Nigel's not going to collect, the money from them, but I would imagine he has to collect taxes from either, the fairly affluent and the super rich, the Richard Bransons of the world, the Rupert Murdochs of the world, those
Sure.
guys. Would he not?
No, well, he's not interested in. I mean, he's part of the whole, going along with the massive inequality agenda in Britain, which is one of the most unequal countries in the world. I mean, I think what we on the left need to get into, and what is missing, is we don't have an alternative program. And I think after this election, I think we need to get down to dealing with that. And funnily enough, that also comes in with the whole international scenario of the rise of the BRICS versus the West, because I think the West, basically the West, including Britain as part of that, are all going down the plug hole.
Yeah,
and that they're not able to, this massive inequality, financialization of the economy, and so on, is meaning that there's no investment in infrastructure, in development of the economy, and so on. So they can't get out of this crisis. It just gets worse and worse, and the rich just trying to do everything they can to get richer, and the poor are getting poorer. Whereas I think that the rise of China and the BRICS is going to offer an alternative over the coming years, which is in terms of a dynamic planning system of planning, of publicly led investment and innovation, etc. And I think that could, I mean, we got this crazy situation in Britain where we can't build anything. When we try to build things, it's always a disaster. Whereas the Chinese are able to build everything. It's amazing. And in fact, we have a railway system. We're trying to build this HS2 railway it was originally from London to Birmingham to Manchester, then across the north, to revitalize the north of Britain. And they've had to cancel half of it, and it's costing a fortune. It's taking forever to do. Whereas if they called the Chinese in, it would have been done at half the cost, double the output, and in half the time. They're so anti-China now.
But wouldn't they also need to have nationalized? Well, I don't think. But also, wouldn't it be great if they had if they renationalized the railways, and if none of the top bosses want to do it, then you could have the Chinese and the Brazilians and others to.
But unfortunately, Starmer is very much in the pockets of the Americans. We've seen this on the Gaza episode, where basically he doesn't say anything unless it's said by Biden first. And literally within half an hour of Biden saying something, then he'll say it. I mean, that's how bad it is. When he was the director of public prosecutions, he was in bed with the CIA and the State Department. And he's no question, in my view, he's their man, in a
very
degree
much
that
so. I mean,
we've never had before.
He told the Swedish authorities to not get cold feet when it came to the trumped up charges against Assange, who we hope will be set free sometime. The people power movements need to definitely step their game up on that. But he was definitely involved in that witch hunt for Julian Assange, as well as slandering his good name. But then that being said, second to last question, which is okay. So if Keir Starmer wins the election, and you believe that he will win enough of a majority that he doesn't need, my hypothetical liberal Democrats and whatnot to help him.
Well, no,
Youri,
Youri, just on that. By the way, Youri, there's a very strange phenomenon taking place right now, which we've never seen before. The Conservatives are going around all the media and saying, we know we're going to lose, and we know we're going to lose big. And what our main appeal now is to Conservatives not to allow Labour to get a super majority.
Yes.
So that's the Conservatives are saying that, and Labour are going around all the media and saying, look, we think we're going to win by good majority, but we don't believe these polls because we think they're too fantastic, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to get complacent or people to vote for independence thinking Labour's going to get in with a big majority. So you've got this freak of a situation on both sides of them.
Very much so.
Yeah, it's a very odd situation, that, isn't it?
Well,
anyway, sorry. Yeah.
Well, if Brexit Pumpkinhead has proved us anything, don't believe the polls, or certainly, don't believe the hype sometime. And if Rishi Sunak wins, it will be. Well, anyways, okay. So hypothetically, so if Labour wins and they win a comfortable majority and so forth, aren't you afraid though, because you're saying that this would be a very great chance for the left to actually mobilize themselves, go back to the drawing board, and have
develop a program and so on.
But don't you think that when, because this often happens when the Labour government, it could be in Australia, New Zealand, Britain, or when the Democrats win, or when that ghastly Liberal Party of Canada wins. Oftentimes, the people power movements, they completely go to sleep. The unions don't mobilize as much as when it's a very hard right government. So I mean, I personally would be more worried that the left is actually just not going to mobilize against Starmer as they. Well, one could argue whether they were that mobilized under David Cameron, under Theresa May, and so forth. But it does seem as if, in Britain, those on the left, the real left, who call themselves socialists, Marxist, Leninists, Trotskyists, and so forth, it seems to me as if they do put up a very good fight when the Tories in power, but when Labour's in power, they either go to sleep or they certainly make sure that, folks like us who would be attacking Labour from the left, that we're sort of, pushed aside. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're right in many occasions that has been true in the past, but I think we're in a very different era, and therefore people don't have, there used to be that a large section of the working people were loyal to Labour, and then you had a large section of the middle class and the rich were loyal to the Conservatives. But I think that this has kind of changed dramatically. I think it was happening for all sorts of social class reasons anyway, and it's been accelerated by what's happened, first of all, when the Iraq War happened under Labour, and then the great economic crash at the end of the 2008, 2009. And then under the Conservatives, the austerity, and then the Brexits happened. And so this is further torn away all these groups from their loyalty. So we now have a very disloyal group. So there are some people who believe that Labour, having won, if they win a big majority, will automatically win the next election. Because they've built up a big majority in each. But if we look at what's been happening, it hasn't been doing that. So, for example, Johnson won his huge majority 2019, and the people thought he'd be in power for a couple of elections. But then they're on the point of losing their biggest majority by the biggest majority ever just a few years later. And I think the same could happen to Labour. I think that the Starmer, and the other strange thing is that normally what used to happen was if one government came in with a big majority, there was a lot of illusions in that leader, and there was a lot of enthusiasm behind them and so on. But this is a very peculiar election because that isn't the situation. So I think that, and even all the commentators themselves are saying that on the mainstream channels, that Labour's now facing the most difficult government since the war. that they don't have any great trust behind them or great enthusiasm. And so if they're not able to deliver on the limited things they've said they're going to do, which is going to be very, very difficult, then very quickly there's going to be a massive amount of discontent with them. And of course, the right-wing media, the GB News, the right-wing Tory party, the Reform Party, will be yapping like mad dogs and trying to take advantage of every possibility they can. So in that situation, everything is up for grabs. And I think the big thing that will be missing, that has been missing up until now for me, is that the left doesn't have a worked out alternative and a way forward that is both coherent and also expressed in language that ordinary people can understand and will remember, will recall and relate to. So if they could overcome that, if they could take advantage of this period that's coming up now, which won't be very long, you know, there used to be a honeymoon, didn't they, for a year or something at least, and sometimes 2 years. This honeymoon would be lucky if they last 6 months for the new Labour government, and
if Keir Starmer becomes prime minister, I certainly, you know, would like our friends of the left in the UK to invite you and me over, and I think we would be very great advisors for a robust new left movement, and who knows, maybe even a new united left party. But because I Britain needs help. You know those situations where the addict needs an intervention. I feel we're really at that stage with both Britain and America.
No, but as the Chinese, you know, the Chinese often say, isn't it, the famous phrase about that, you know, every danger is an opportunity, you know, every difficult situation is every crisis is an opportunity. You can see that the British public, like in Europe as a whole, and I think probably the same in North America, they're no longer, they're all at sea, and that means they can go in many different directions and be attracted to what is the most attractive pole there, and we've got to be that attractive pole if we want to. But at least we've got, it's not a situation where everything is static.
Yeah.
You know, it can go in lots of different ways. I mean, for example, it was always said that Labour could never win a majority in England. It's always said, it was always believed for the last 100 years, but they're actually going to win a majority in England. It's incredible. Amazing.
But definitely not in Scotland.
Well, now in Scotland they are having a revival, but it doesn't seem to be going as far. So I think they'll get a good, they'll increase their number of MPs in Scotland a lot, but I think their biggest gains are going to be in England, which is very weird.
Oh, and actually, to anybody in Scotland, I would say hold your nose and vote SNP, but also vote Scottish Greens and vote Alba, because I think Scottish independence, which I am a supporter of, needs to broaden its church, just like in Quebec. You see, Quebec is smart like that. Even though Quebec is not independent, there's a broad church of like Quebec nationalists. There are several left-wing ones, there are several right-wing ones, and I think that's what needs to happen in Scotland if they want to become independent. But for that, you would need the Scottish Conservatives to divorce themselves from the Conservative Party, and the same with Labour or Liberal Democrats and so forth. But that being said, I'm not too happy with a lot of the Scottish nationalist parties. But yeah, in Wales, well, yeah, it's going to be curious. It'll be curious. It's going to be very curious to see how the election.
Well, I won't be surprised if nationalism has a big resurgence under an unpopular Labour government. I could see a big resurgence in nationalism in Scotland and Wales, definitely.
Yes, and then that means Great Britain
and in Northern Ireland, of course, in Northern Ireland as well. Yeah.
I know I'm wearing the Union Jack. Look, I love the Union Jack. It's a beautiful flag, but I do not believe in the concept of Great Britain. England
Yeah,
its own country.
The design of the Union Jack, could easily change.
Back with the Republic.
there could be certain big changes in that design of that flag over the next 5-10 years, couldn't there? You know.
All righty. Pat, before I let you enjoy
Mm.
the rest of your evening, we usually end the program doing the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, later the late popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and of course the late great my hero James Lipton. Pat, it's your turn to do this. Pat, what's your favorite word?
Dynamic.
What is your least favorite word?
Static.
Interesting. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
The idea of ordinary people being able to have a say in all the institutions of society.
Fantastic. What turns you off then?
The top-down approach that applies across society, including among the left.
Yes, and in the unions as well. What is your favorite curse word?
Mm.
And hey, I know you live in Brazil, and I know, and so you can use a Brazilian Portuguese curse word if you prefer one of them.
Favorites. Fecking.
That's the
The Irish. That's the Irish version. Right?
What sound or noise do you love?
No, I know, but the expression is and to use it as part of the expression is feck them and feck them again.
What sound or noise do you love?
What? Sorry?
What sound or noise do you love?
Some parts of Pink Floyd.
Some parts. Interesting.
Yes.
I imagine only.
You know the woman singing in The Great Gig in the Sky.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought it's fantastic. Yeah.
And solidarity to Roger Waters. Need to try to get him on the show. He is great friends of people power movements. Might not be as articulate as that guy over there, John Lennon, but he really has taken on that mantle of voice of a.
Yeah, I like him a lot. Yeah.
Then what sound or noise do you dislike then?
Sucking up.
Ah, yes. Any examples of that?
Too many.
All righty. What profession, if you weren't doing the great work that you do, trying to build up an anti-imperialist movement, trade unionism, and always fighting for workers' rights and fights of and the good fight for all marginalized people. So if you weren't doing that, and some of the journalism you do, and some of the education you do, and the activism, what would you love to do?
I like to play chess.
Interesting. Okay. All right.
But no, but I don't do it now. I don't have the time, but I would like to. Yeah.
Okay. Then, what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Sewage worker.
Great answer.
And you know, it might be shit to you and me, but it's bread and butter to them.
True, exactly.
That was a slogan of one of the strikes.
Exactly. And then lastly, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision or belief in the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please still feel free to still respond.
What I would like them to say, you're a bit early, Pat.
A bit early, but we welcome you in, right?
No, meaning that you can come back a bit later on. You died a bit too early.
Well, Pat, here's hoping that you continue to live a very, very long life. Now, we were joined on this edition of 1+1. Before I end, solidarity, of course, to Palestine, and this is
Sure.
solidarity to the Palestinians, solidarity to all of those, including those in Britain who are the students, the young people who are protesting against
Exactly, yeah.
Israel, and long live not long live the struggle. I hope, down with the Zionist states, democratic, secular, one-state solution, BDS now. And Pat, we'll try to have you back on the show to do an election autopsy, but we also need to have you back on the program because you are currently working on a book about China. I of course, I am against the pivot to Asia, and the last several years, my mind has been decolonized a lot on all things China. So we're going to definitely have to have you back on to talk all things China and why leftists such as myself and others who are frontline activists need to build a movement around BRICS and advance the left movement there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So until
I look forward to that.
Yeah, as well. So until then, we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Pat Byrne, longtime trade unionist activist and British leftist based in Brasilia. And yes, and until then, power to the people, folks. And this is our All Things England edition. Let's hope cooler heads prevail, and peace until then.
Yeah. Cheers.